We are still uncertain as to the whereabouts of a Washington Post journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, who was also a Saudi dissident who had self-exiled here to the United States out of an abundance of caution. He had been critical of the Saudi royals and was worried about his safety, which is why he came here to the United States. Now, he has gone missing after he went to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. He had went there to receive a document necessary to marry his Turkish fiance, and he never came out of the building. Now, there is some indication that he was either abducted or, based on what the Turkish government is saying, killed by Saudi authorities who had arrived on chartered flights following his arrival to the consulate. Now, the Turkish investigators are saying that they have evidence that he was murdered. No one has seen that evidence yet. The Turkish investigators have been in contact with US intelligence officials. It's unclear whether those intelligence officials have seen this evidence, but according to what we know so far, the recordings show that a Saudi security team detained Khashoggi in the consulate after he walked in October 2nd to obtain this official document before his upcoming wedding, then killed him and dismembered his body. The individual who spoke on the condition of anonymity said that the voice recording from inside the embassy lays out what happened to Jamal after he entered. You can hear his voice and the voices of men speaking Arabic. You can hear how he was interrogated, tortured, and then murdered. And the same individual also says that you can hear the Saudi officials beating him in the recording. Now, Turkish officials are also wary of releasing these recordings because they fear that it could divulge how the Turks spy on foreign entities in their country, although I think it's pretty clear already, right?
Yeah. I don't think there's much confusion about that.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, okay, look, I get it that you guys see him on video going into the embassy, and you check the video in the back and the front, and you never see him coming out. I get that. How do you know they brought a bone saw? How do you know that they dismembered him? And so, of course, they don't want to say it in the beginning, but it's super obvious. And it's not just the Saudis, I imagine, and it's not just the Turks. My guess is most of the host countries tap most of the embassies that are in their respective countries. So be forewarned, okay? And so the Turks apparently had a way of, they say not only audio, but video recordings inside the consulate of Saudi Arabia. So they seem to have the goods.
Right, so this is all information that we shared with you in previous shows where we talked about this very story, but there are updates that I want to get into. So first off, what is the reaction from businesses and the media here in the United States? Well, for one, Trump has been very clear in stating that he will continue the sale of US weapons to the Saudis, regardless of what happened to Khashoggi. We'll show you that video in just a second. But more importantly, we now have members of the media and other individuals who are boycotting certain events in Saudi Arabia. One of those events is the Future Investment Initiative, and it's supposed to take place in Riyadh. But there are a number of people who have now said, no, we're not going, we're not interested in that. Andrew Ross Sorkin, who is one of the anchors on CNBC, will not go. And also the editor-in-chief for The Economist is no longer gonna go. But there is one person who's gonna go, and that's Steve Mnuchin, who is the Treasury Secretary here in the United States. I'm gonna skip ahead and go to video 2. Let's hear what he has to say.
We are concerned about what is the status of Mr. Khashoggi. I am planning on going at this point. If more information comes out and changes, we could look at that, but I am planning on going.
So he's planning on going. We don't have enough information yet, so.
I don't know if people are gonna think this is overly broad, but for a lot of the Gulf countries that are dictatorships, I've said for a long, long time, I think it's crazy to go, ever. And certainly for Saudi Arabia, they're a dictatorship and they have absurd laws that they can and do enforce on you in weird ways from time to time. We've covered dozens of stories, people holding hands or kissing in public or appearing to be a same-sex couple, whatever. And they're like, okay, that's it, you're in prison for 13 years. What?
Right.
No, you're crazy to go to those countries. I'm keeping it real. I'm not going, I've never gone, I'm not gonna go until they get a government that represents their own people and that is a liberal democracy. And now, if you're a reporter, you ought to have your head examined going to Saudi Arabia. And look at what they just did to this columnist.
Right. Well, real quick, if you guys are worried that the US is not going to take enough action, Trump did say something, and I want to make sure we're fair to him and we give him his exact quote. He says, quote, "We're looking at it very strongly."
Oh, well, I didn't know you were looking at it. That's
and he said it's not a big deal. What did he say? He said we're not concerned. It was a double negative, which means there was no assertion. But I think there's so many things swirling. One is that, to your comment, unfortunately, there is a protected elite class of Americans who don't get to experience that kind of repression when they enter into the country. I mean, there's a ban on alcohol and embassies carry alcohol in the country. So there are little things like that. But when you're talking about the symbolic consent to what the Saudi government is doing by showing up to actually a big deal meeting, this investment fund meeting has been designed because, guess what? The Saudi government is running out of money. They have really low oil projections to the point where they are gonna start taxing their citizens. And this is a big deal because the Saudi state has radical unemployment, which a lot of people don't know about. So not everybody's rolling in wealth. And so they're looking for opportunities from the outside to get investment inside. And I mean, there's so much with this story that I want to talk about. One is that it's interesting that there is focus on Khashoggi, which I love. I love the fact that the West is putting pressure on our president. Politicians are putting pressure on our system to withdraw from more arms deals that go into our disastrous war in Yemen.
Can I ask you a question?
Saudi's disastrous war in Yemen that we support through refueling and intelligence and.
So Cenk and I spoke about that a little bit yesterday, and really all we could really do at that point was speculate as to why, because we've had a long history of bad behavior from the Saudis, and it seems as though no one's been willing to hold their feet to the fire until now. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that the US doesn't take kindly to repression of journalists. I mean, we have multiple movies that have just come out in the last couple of years about Nixon silencing and censoring the Post. We have the Spotlight story. So we have this, whether or not it's absolutely true, this notion of ourselves as protecting freedom of speech, right? So when we point to that, it means something. Khashoggi is a very interesting story, what his family, where he comes from and what his family represents in the global market. And maybe perhaps we can go into that at another point because it's a much longer story. But I think that also the murder of one person is something that is tangible to people. You know, Stalin said that killing one person is a tragedy, killing millions of people is a statistic.
Interesting.
So that's how people can understand the story. They can't understand millions of people who are at jeopardy of a famine in Yemen. They can't understand the hundreds of thousands of people that are killed in Syria. It's too much to wrap your brain around and for you to extend a certain kind of empathy because you don't see it in your everyday life. So the killing of one person just hits home, and that sort of story is the story that broke World War I. You know, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and some historians speculated that that was the reason for the start of World War I.
Interesting.
Yeah, so look, whenever it's someone who's in the elite, it makes a much bigger difference. Let's keep it real. He was part of the Saudi elite and in their mind betrayed them by actually being honest about them. And here he's a Washington Post columnist. So that counts 1,000 times more than a child in Yemen. It's horrible, but that's the way that it works. It shouldn't work that way, but if you're writing for the Washington Post, it's a lot more personal for you. And that's partly why we're on that warpath.
And I'm just really curious how much he means if this is a terrible thing. We're gonna look into it. I feel like oftentimes when he says that, it's very empty.
When Trump says that?
Yeah, when Trump says that.
Yeah, I can see why you'd think that.
Right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, and look, to to provide evidence for why someone would be concerned about whether or not Trump really cares. I mean, when he was talking about this in front of the press just yesterday, he mentioned the citizenship status of this journalist, like basically trying to make a point about how this isn't like a US citizen. He's not a US citizen, right? Like he's a resident. I mean, he was first of all, you should know that before speaking to the press. You're the president of the United States. Right. But more importantly, what does his citizenship status matter? I mean, he was here in the United States. He was working for the Washington Post, and he was targeted specifically because he's been critical to the Saudi royals, who Trump has been, very complimentary toward, and has, gone to great lengths to do, positive PR for. So. I don't know. I don't think that he really cares that much.
He also does have a long history with the Khashoggi family. So this is putting him in really sticky waters, but not that Trump is a loyal person. He's loyal to the point of his own personal interests being protected. And I'm just curious to really see how this pans out, because it seems like a gross political miscalculation on the part of MBS. I don't understand why doing it in another country, a country that you're also in really dirty waters with. There's a huge proxy war going on, and if folks don't know, I'm sure we've talked about it on the show multiple times, but there is this Turkish-Qatari alliance that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other Gulf countries are in opposition with, and sometimes it's kind of a Cold War, and sometimes things get flared and reflared, and for this to happen on Turkish soil, I don't know how this is not going to embroil into something massive.
Yeah, and look, that's because Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is totally reckless. I mean, he kidnapped a foreign leader, the leader of Lebanon. That's insanity. Yes. When that guy, by the way, Mnuchin, I mean, we're the US. Unlikely that he's going to kidnap our Treasury Secretary. But it's not unprecedented. He's kidnapped the leader of a country before. And the guy, look, we're his ally. So again, it's almost no chance of it. But you're playing with your life by in dealing with this guy at all. And goes to another way of showing his recklessness, which is on the financial grounds. So they're in massive financial trouble. Part of the reason that he kidnapped and imprisoned the other Saudi royals on total BS charges of corruption. I mean, the charges might be real, but he's even more corrupt, right? So it's disingenuous in that sense. In the middle of that, he bought a $500 million yacht for himself.
Sounds like a good investment.
I mean, sounds like a Trump investment.
Yeah, if you're worried about, oh my God, the Saudi finances are in trouble, you don't buy a $500 million yacht. And the fact that the US did so much propaganda on his behalf, including a lot of the mainstream press, now all of a sudden come to find out he kills members of the press, and they're not, oops, right? Well, you should have thought of that before you were doing all that positive press. I remember on this show we were saying, why is CBS, 60 Minutes, and all these other outlets, saying this guy's some sort of reformer? We already knew he kidnapped a foreign leader. We already knew he was trying to foment a civil war within the Palestinian territories and in Lebanon. We knew what an out of control dictator he was before, but yet he was feted. Why? Because if you pay enough money in Washington, you're gonna get a lot of great propaganda no matter what you do, until you come for the guys who are giving you the propaganda.
Right, and just a quick note on that. I mean, the American press doesn't care about what Saudi Arabia wants to do to Palestinian territories. Right. We already know how the US press covers what happens to Palestinians living in Palestinian territories.
Yeah, and I should note, I mentioned the Gulf countries. To be fair, just yesterday we covered the story of Israel imprisoning people who don't agree with Netanyahu, or have the wrong opinion on the BDS movement. So you want to boycott Israel, etc. And the woman, the 22-year-old from Florida, an American citizen, she doesn't even believe in that. She's going to study at Hebrew University. They're like, yeah, don't care. And she's been in prison for over a week, being detained because she has the temerity to disagree with the right-wing government of Israel. So unfortunately, this authoritarian streak is growing worldwide, and it is deeply disturbing. Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.